Hello, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. It has been a week since the RFU dropped the bombshell news that from next season, levels 3 and below in the community game, that players would have to tackle from the waist down. It has been 7 days where the RFU have faced a huge amount of backlash, not just from the community game, but the professional game as well. Emotions are running high. So in this video, I'm going to try and summarize where we are at this moment in time and what might happen going forward, but also importantly, the questions that I don't think are being asked enough and what we really need answers on in this debate. If you are new here, do subscribe to the channel, like the video, and drop a comment down below. What have you made of the proposed law changes, the reaction to it, and what would you like to see happen moving forward? All right, let's get into it. So stick around for the ending section of this video. In my kind of conclusions, I'm going to ask the question, first of all, about how big an issue is concussion in the community game, because I don't think we've had that question answered yet, and I don't think that question is being posed enough. And also, I'll go back to something that I mentioned in the video I did last week in my kind of reactionary video to this news, of is it just a case really now of we need to think of rugby in a different way? We need to rebrand it as a blood sport more similar to how we think of boxing or something like that, a sport we know isn't safe, but people can make their own opinions. So I'll get onto all of that towards the end of the video. But starting off, just the backstory for this, I'm sure most of you, pretty much all of you, I'd imagine, watching this will be aware. Last week, the RFU suddenly, out of nowhere, out the blue, announced the fact that from next season, basically any level below the championship, so National 1 and below, including the women's game outside of the Premier 15s, younger age groups, would have to tackle from the waist and lower. And that was met by a huge backlash from the community game, from the professional game. And the concerns from people really were a whole range of things, from a real drop in participation. A lot of people who would leave the game and wouldn't play because of this, partly because they don't like the sound of what that rule change would mean, the sort of game that it would look like. It wouldn't be rugby anymore, but also just there's a lot of people in community clubs who, you know, playing for old boys, teams and things like that, that simply would struggle to tackle that low on a consistent basis. It would be a nightmare to officiate as well. And then also from the professional club's point of view, and I'll get a little bit more onto this later on in the video, incredibly difficult for them to recruit and how they bring players through that pathway. Because if this law change did come in its current guise, in, I don't know, 5-10 years time, you're going to be having players come through who have only ever learned to play the game tackling one way, and all of a sudden they'd be playing to a different set of laws in the professional game, potentially, if this law didn't come into the professional game. So there were all sorts of issues and concerns. Now, there is a similar situation in France. Their laws, I believe, are a little bit different in the French system, a little bit different there. But they have similar laws. And I was listening actually to the BBC's Rugby Union podcast, or Five Live's Rugby Union Weekly, this week, where they read out 2 emails of really contrasting messages from people that play the game in France. One person who said that the law change has been incredibly effective, it's an enjoyable game to play, and someone else saying that it led to a big drop in participation numbers. It's incredibly difficult to officiate. So I'm not entirely sure what to take from that, but in the interest of balance, I just thought I would mention that at the start of the video. But as I say, huge backlash to this news. So where are we now 7 days on? Well, the RFU have said, and they've been chasing their tail after this news really, they've said that more guidance on how it will work and the implementation of it, etc., will come in due course. The next RFU council meeting is on the 13th of February. Those councillors have been under a huge amount of pressure, unsurprisingly, where that's going to be discussed, how it's going to work, I think it's going to be discussed, and also how they went about putting the message out there will be on the table as well. But also I saw in the Times today, and I would encourage all of you to go and search out Alex Lowe's piece in the Times newspaper. The RFU board and Bill Sweeney, the chief executive, now face a vote of no confidence after over 200 community clubs basically banded together and called for a special general meeting. As I understand it, I think they needed 100 clubs to make that happen. They've got over 200, which just gives you a sense of the feeling amongst these community clubs and the anger they're feeling, the isolation they're feeling from the powers that be at Twickenham who came about making this decision. And that's kind of, I think, the biggest issue with this is the complete lack of consultation for the clubs. The way in which the RFU have gone about this is an utter PR disaster. I mean, I honestly don't know what on earth they were thinking would happen, where they just kind of put a press release out there, this is going to change, which would fundamentally change the game in England. And it was a press release. There weren't details of how it would work. It wasn't details of how it would be coached or officiated. There was no consultation with any of the clubs that it would be affected. And you're just looking at it thinking, and the RFU gets a tough time press-wise a lot of the time, but it's decisions like this and processes like this, which is exactly why. It's just utterly ridiculous. So that's where we are at the moment. The RPA, the union, the Professional Players Union, has said that it's broadly in favour of the direction of travel in terms of making the game safer. But if any tweaks were to be made to the elite game, they would need extensive consultation. And that's exactly the issue, I think, here, or the biggest issue here, is the complete lack of consultation towards any of those community clubs. Also, just sort of, I thought it was quite interesting, just a smattering of reaction from the Gallagher Premiership this week. You can imagine in all the press conferences, the directors of Rugby have been asked about it. Rob Baxter at Exeter kind of made the point that Rugby likes making knee-jerk law changes, which makes the game very hard to follow and quite hard to play as well. And he suggested we need a lot more understanding about what it would mean for the ball carrier as well, because apparently the ball carrier won't be allowed to dip into tackles in the way they are at the moment, which again is something that to me, it just makes it so difficult for a ball carrier, particularly if it's someone who's a little bit more lightweight. If they're having to run into a tackle upright, surely they're just going to be getting absolutely hammered at the gain line every single time. I don't know. We'll wait and see. George Skivington at Gloucester said he didn't think it was smart. You're asking for trouble when you start going below the waist. And there has been a lot of concern, which has actually been echoed by Pat Lamb at Bristol as well, where he said he thinks it'll be much better for the ball carrier because there's going to be less collisions where it's head on head, but not so much for the tackler. There's a lot of concern about what's going to happen to the tackler when you force them to tackle around the waist, but particularly, I think, around kind of the knees and ankles where they're getting hits to the head that way as well. There seems to be a lot of people, particularly in the professional game, that aren't really sure if that's going to result in what they want it to result in. So a big outpouring, the RFU under pressure, facing votes of no confidence, councillors under a lot of pressure and could be ousted from their positions as well. I forget the name of it now, but there's also been an independent kind of body of the community club, a union, I guess, sort of thing, for the community clubs, and a representative body to represent their interests in all of this. So there is a huge schism brewing here at the community and at the amateur game in English rugby. But to get on to my kind of conclusions here, I personally don't think anyone is opposed to change per se. I don't think they like this change. I think they view this as quite drastic. And actually, I'd encourage all of you to search out Ross Tucker, who is a professor who's really good on a lot of different science things within sport. He has the Real Science of Sport podcast, which he does, where they talk about all sorts of issues. And he's also worked with World Rugby previously in terms of concussions and doing research and things like that. So he's a guy that knows what he's talking about. So he did a podcast on this and also a blog on this week, where there's basically different areas of contact. So if you imagine two players being upright is kind of a red zone, because you've got head on head. You've then got kind of I guess you call it kind of the torso area, tackling there, which is actually the green zone, which leads to the least amount of concussions. And then you have the amber zone, which is basically the waist and below. And the RFU have changed the laws to go for that amber zone. Now, part of the reason for doing that is because if you're in the amber zone and you get it wrong, you're heading into the green zone. Whereas if they made the law the green zone and they get it wrong, you could be heading into the red zone. But anyway, I'm kind of going off on a tangent there. I do encourage you to search out that Ross Tucker. If you find his Twitter, you'll be able to find that blog or the Real Science of Sport podcast, where they talk about it in more detail, which kind of went into the fact that, you know, looking for change is good, but going back to my original point, I think it's these changes that people are opposed to because of the complete lack of discussion. There's been no presentation of evidence whatsoever. We don't even really know what the waistline counts as at the moment. What do the RFU mean by that? There's no evidence been put forward for why they're bringing these changes in. They've said that they have the evidence, but none of us have been able to see it. And also overall, there's just been no sense of bringing people with you. The RFU haven't gone to the community game and say, look, we've got an issue here, we need to protect you all, how's best to go about implementing that and bring everyone along with you. Had they done that, then I think they would have eventually been able to bring changes in, but the way in which they've done it has just been a complete and utter disaster. And as I said at the beginning of this video, how big an issue is concussion in the community game? Now, I don't know the answers to this, but this is surely fundamental to the decisions to change the laws at the community level. Because if we look at the professional game, and it's been professional, 20, 30, almost 30 years now. So the game's been professional, and the increase in speed, the increase in physicality, the overall conditioning and size of the players is chalk and cheese between those periods. It has leapt on massively. So of course, concussions and things like that have become a huge issue in the professional game, and that needs changing. I also think there's been an element of a drip down effect to say that National 1 level, to be fair, and that kind of semi-professional level where people are in the gym more, there's more of an emphasis on physicality. I think concussions are probably a bigger issue there, but how much has the community game, the truly amateur game, changed in the last 30 years? Sure, I'm sure it has a little bit. I think gym culture's come in, our understanding of conditioning, but how actually big is it? How drastically different is the community game to what it has always been? And is concussion an issue there? All the studies that get done, as far as I can tell, are on the professional game. I just don't think that is relative to the community game. And I think that's a massive flaw in this whole argument, which is not being spoken about at the moment. And then the final thing as well, as I mentioned in the previous video, we need to try and make rugby safer with stand down periods and head injury assessments and our overall understanding of the game. But you can't change the game from its absolute fundamentals, because ultimately you won't have that game anymore. And I just wonder whether it is time that rugby needs to be redefined as a blood sport, like boxing or something like that, where of course, as I've just said, you try and make it as safe as you can, but it gets to a point where there is still always going to be an element of risk. You acknowledge that risk and you allow people to make their own decisions about it. That to me would make more sense, but let's wait and see. Let's wait and see if there is evidence. If they do have evidence that concussions is a huge, huge issue in the community game, then I will stand corrected. But I think that is a question that needs to be answered at this moment in time. Okay, this video ended up being a little bit of a longer one than a lot of them, but I just think there's so much to get into there. It's a really interesting topic. It's a massive moment for the game in England. So let's wait and see. I'll continue to do videos when we have updates on it. But as I said at the top, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and drop a comment down below. What do you make of everything I've gone through in this video? In particular, those last 2 points. Is concussion an issue if you play the game maybe at the amateur community level? And does rugby need to be redefined as a blood sport? All right, I'll see you in the next one.